Mark Thompson loved his peaceful life on the outskirts of town. His property sat just outside the HOA's grasp, which meant he didn't have to deal with their ridiculous rules, pointless fines, or nosy neighborhood gossip. He focused on raising his two kids, his 14-year-old son, Elijah, and his 10-year-old daughter, Maya, while running his small farm. But despite being outside the HOA's jurisdiction, he wasn't free from its worst resident, Karen. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, always pushing her authority onto people who didn't ask for it. Mark had clashed with her before, but as long as she stayed away from his land and his family, he let her nonsense slide. That changed one chilly morning when Elijah and Maya came home from the bus stop looking shaken. Mark was in the kitchen pouring coffee when he heard the front door creak open. "You two are home early," he said, turning toward them, but his smile faded when he saw their faces. Maya's eyes were wide and Elijah looked tense, his hands balled into fists. "What happened?" Mark asked, setting his mug down. Maya hesitated, glancing up at her brother. Elijah exhaled sharply before answering. "It was that HOA lady, Karen." Mark stiffened. "What did she do?" "She was waiting at the bus stop when we got there," Elijah explained. "As soon as she saw us, she started asking where we lived." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" "She said we didn't belong in the neighborhood," Maya whispered. "She kept saying we were from around here." Mark felt his blood pressure spike. His kids had been catching the school bus at that same stop for years, just like other kids who lived near the HOA. There had never been a problem before. "She told us we had to prove we lived here," Elijah added, his voice tight with anger. "She kept saying this was a nice neighborhood and that we shouldn't be loitering." Mark's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what Karen was implying. "And when I told her we lived right over there," Elijah pointed toward their property, "she said that wasn't really part of the community and that we were welcome to use the bus stop." Mark inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. "Did she threaten you?" Elijah shook his head. "Not exactly, but she kept standing in front of us, blocking us from getting to the curb. The bus driver had to tell her to move so we could get on." Mark's hands tightened into fists. Karen had crossed a line. No, she had obliterated it. She hadn't just been rude, she had targeted his children. And that was something Mark wasn't going to let slide. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady the rage bubbling inside him. His kids had done nothing wrong. They weren't trespassing, they weren't causing trouble. They were just waiting for the bus, like any other child in the neighborhood. But Karen had singled them out, harassing them as if they were criminals simply because they weren't the kind of people she thought belonged. That was going to stop. "Stay here," he told Elijah and Maya. "I'll handle this." Elijah hesitated. "Dad, she's just going to act all innocent when you talk to her." Mark nodded. "Oh, I know, that's why I'm not just talking to her." He grabbed his phone, stepped outside, and walked straight toward the bus stop, which sat at the edge of the HOA community. He half hoped Karen would still be lurking around, but the street was empty. That was fine. He knew exactly where to find her. A short walk later, he was standing in front of Karen's pristine white house, complete with a flagpole, identical flower beds, and a ridiculous HOA president sign staked into her lawn. Mark rapped his knuckles against the door, waiting. A moment later, Karen appeared, her expression twisting into a fake smile the second she saw him. "Oh, Mark, what a surprise." Mark didn't return the pleasantries. "We need to talk." Karen sighed, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "If this is about that little misunderstanding at the bus stop, There was no misunderstanding," Mark cut in, his voice cold. "You harassed my kids." Karen's face twitched. "Harassed? Oh, please. I was simply ensuring that the right kind of people were using the neighborhood bus stop." Mark's fists clenched. "The right kind of people." Karen folded her arms, tilting her head. "Mark, you must understand. We have rules in this community. We can't just let anyone loiter around." "They weren't loitering," Mark snapped. "They were waiting for the school bus just like every other kid here." Karen scoffed. "And yet they don't live here." Mark took a step forward, lowering his voice to something dangerous. They live right over there, Karen. I own that property. Just because we're not part of your HOA doesn't mean my kids don't belong. Karen's fake smile didn't waver, but her eyes were sharp and full of entitlement. It's nothing personal, Mark, but let's be honest. You know how this neighborhood operates. We have standards, and certain types of people just don't fit in. Mark's entire body stiffened. There it was, the unspoken truth behind her behavior. She didn't just have a problem with where his kids lived. She had a problem with who they were. And Mark was done playing nice. "You're going to regret this," he said calmly. Karen chuckled, completely unfazed. "Oh, Mark, what are you going to do? Complain? The HOA stands by me." Mark smirked. "Oh, I'm not going to complain." He lifted his phone, revealing the screen. "I'm going to report you." Karen's face paled as she realized what he meant. Because every single word she had just spoken had been recorded. Karen's fake smile vanished as she stared at Mark's phone. You were recording me." Mark nodded. "Damn right I was." Her expression flickered between outrage and panic. "That's illegal. You can't just—" Mark cut her off. "Actually, I can. We're in a one-party consent state. As long as I know I'm recording, it's perfectly legal." He tilted his head. "I'd have thought the almighty HOA president would know that." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Mark continued, his voice low and steady. "So let's go over what just happened. You harassed my kids at the bus stop. You implied they didn't belong in the neighborhood. And then you doubled down on it right here on my recording." He smirked. "I'm sure the school district, the police, and maybe even the local news would find that very interesting." Karen's face turned bright red. "Now, hold on, let's not be dramatic." Mark stepped closer. "You messed with the wrong family, Karen." She lifted her chin, trying to regain control. "This is ridiculous. I was just following HOA policies. I was ensuring community safety." Mark shook his head. "No, you were racially profiling my kids." Karen flinched at the words, but before she could deny it, Mark pressed play on the recording. Her own voice rang out, crystal clear. "We have standards, and certain types of people just don't fit in." Karen's face drained of all color. "You didn't just cross a line," Mark said, his voice firm. "You ran past it, set it on fire, and danced on the ashes." He gestured with his phone. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to issue a written apology to my kids. You're going to publicly admit that you overstepped. And if I ever hear that you so much as look at them the wrong way again, I'm taking this straight to the police." Karen's hands trembled. "Mark, please, there's no need to." "Oh, but there is," Mark interrupted. "Because if you don't, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. And let's be real, your precious HOA reputation wouldn't survive that." Karen swallowed hard, glancing around as if looking for a way out. But she knew she was trapped. Mark let the silence stretch before finally adding, "Your move, Karen." She inhaled shakily, glaring at him, but for once she had nothing to say. Because she knew she'd lost. Karen's entire body tensed, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Mark could practically see the gears turning in her head, trying to find a way out of the mess she had created. But there wasn't one, not this time. After a long, tense pause, she finally spoke through gritted teeth. "What exactly do you want from me?" Mark crossed his arms. "I already told you. A written apology to my kids, a public admission that you were out of line, and if you ever harass them again, this recording goes straight to the authorities." Karen exhaled sharply. "This is absurd. You're blackmailing me." Mark smirked. "No, Karen, you did this to yourself. I'm just giving you the opportunity to fix it before the consequences catch up to you." She looked away, jaw tight. He could tell she hated every second of this, but there was no escape. Then, as if on cue, the front door behind her swung open, and her husband, a tired-looking man named Richard, stepped outside. He frowned as he took in the tense scene. "Karen, what's going on?" Karen spun toward him, flustered. "Nothing, just a misunderstanding." Mark let out a short laugh. Oh, it's definitely a misunderstanding, like how your wife misunderstood that she has zero authority over my kids. He turned to Richard. Maybe you can help her understand. Richard's expression darkened. Karen, what did you do this time? Karen shot Mark a glare, but she knew she was cornered. Before she could spin a new lie, Mark held up his phone. I recorded everything, he said simply. Richard's shoulders sagged and he rubbed his temples. Jesus, Karen. Karen whirled on him. You're taking his side. Richard sighed. No, Karen, I'm taking the side of common sense. I told you before, this HOA nonsense is going to get you into trouble. And now you're out here harassing children. Karen sputtered. I was protecting the neighborhood. You know how things have been. Enough, Richard snapped, his patience finally breaking. I'm sick of this. You're always starting fights, always overstepping. And now, because of your big mouth, Mark has proof that could ruin you. Karen paled. I didn't mean. Richard shook his head. No, you never mean it, but you always do it. He turned to Mark. Look, I don't blame you for being angry. If I were in your shoes, I'd be furious. Mark nodded. Then you know what needs to happen. Richard exhaled, then looked at Karen. You will write that apology. You will make a public statement. And after that, you're done with the HOA. No more power trips. No more harassing people. You got that. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but one look at Richard's face shut her up. Defeated, she crossed her arms and muttered, Fine. Mark smiled, smart choice. But he wasn't done yet. Because Karen needed to learn that some mistakes came with bigger consequences. And he was going to make damn sure she got exactly what she deserved. Mark walked away from Karen's house with a smirk, but he wasn't satisfied just yet. An apology? That was the bare minimum. Karen needed to feel the weight of what she had done, not just to his kids, but to every person she had ever harassed under the excuse of protecting the neighborhood. So Mark made a few phone calls. First, he contacted the school district. He forwarded the recording to the superintendent, explaining how Karen had harassed 2 students at a public bus stop. The district had very clear policies against discrimination, and they took complaints like this seriously. Next, he called the local news station. Small-town reporters loved stories like this. An HOA president caught harassing kids. A racially charged incident in an affluent neighborhood. That was the kind of thing that would spread like wildfire. And finally, he contacted the police. Because while Karen hadn't physically harmed his kids, her actions could easily be considered harassment or even intimidation of a minor. And given that he had clear evidence, there was a real chance she'd face actual consequences. By the time he got back home, he had set the wheels in motion. Elijah and Maya were in the living room when he walked in, both still looking uneasy. Mark knelt down in front of them. Listen, he said gently. I know what happened this morning was scary, but I want you to know that it's not your fault. You did nothing wrong. Maya sniffled. She made us feel like we weren't supposed to be here. Mark's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Well, she was wrong. You belong here just like everyone else, and I'm making sure she understands that. Elijah frowned. What do you mean? Mark smiled. Let's just say she's about to learn a very important lesson about messing with the wrong family. And sure enough, the fallout began faster than he expected. By that evening, the school district had launched an investigation, and the local news had already picked up the story. A journalist even reached out to Mark, asking if he'd be willing to give a statement. But the best part, the police showed up at Karen's house. Mark sat on his porch with a fresh beer, watching with satisfaction as 2 officers knocked on her door. Karen answered, looking irritated, until she realized who was standing there. Even from a distance, Mark could hear her shrill voice arguing with them. But the officers weren't buying her excuses. One of them gestured to the patrol car, while the other held out a pair of handcuffs. Karen's face drained of color. Mark leaned back in his chair, smiling as he watched the officers place Karen under arrest for harassment of a minor. It was poetic justice. And the best part, this was only the beginning of her downfall. The neighborhood was eerily quiet as Karen was led to the police car, her hands cuffed behind her back. She was still squawking in outrage, her voice rising in frantic protest. "This is ridiculous. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. This is a misunderstanding. Call my lawyer, call the HOA." The officers didn't care. They calmly read her rights as they guided her into the backseat, shutting the door with finality. Mark leaned against his porch railing, watching with satisfaction as Karen's world collapsed around her. A few of the neighbors had gathered outside, whispering amongst themselves, clearly stunned by the scene unfolding before them. And then, just when Mark thought things couldn't get any better, Greg, the HOA's vice president, stepped forward. His expression was grim as he approached the officers. "Excuse me, but what exactly is she being charged with?" One of the officers turned to him. "Harassment of a minor, possibly intimidation. We're still reviewing the complaint." Greg's face paled, and his gaze flickered toward Mark. He opened his mouth to say something, but Mark simply lifted his beer in a mock toast. Greg swallowed hard. He knew, they all knew. The HOA was screwed. Meanwhile, Karen's husband, Richard, stood frozen near their front door, rubbing his temples in frustration. He had the expression of a man who had been dealing with this for years and was finally out of patience. As the police car started pulling away, Karen's voice screeched from inside. "Richard, do something." But Richard just shook his head. "You did this to yourself, Karen." The moment the police car disappeared down the road, the whispers in the neighborhood turned into full-blown murmurs. "Did you hear what she said to Mark's kids? She really thought she could get away with that. I always knew she was a nightmare, but this is next level." Mark couldn't help but smirk. Finally, the same people who had once let Karen run wild were turning on her. Greg cleared his throat awkwardly and turned toward Mark. "Look, on behalf of the HOA, I just want to say that we had no idea she was doing this. We don't condone." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Oh, save it, Greg. You let her run things however she wanted. You let her harass people. You only care now because she finally messed with someone who fought back." Greg had the decency to look ashamed. He shifted uncomfortably before muttering, We'll be holding an emergency meeting to discuss her removal from the HOA board." Mark smiled. Smart choice. With that, he turned on his heel and walked back inside, leaving Greg to deal with the growing crowd of furious homeowners. But Mark knew this wasn't over. Because she was about to face real consequences. Karen was released on bail the next morning, but the damage had already been done. By the time she returned home, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. The local news had run a segment on her arrest, and people who had once whispered about Karen's overreach were now openly discussing her downfall. Parents were furious. The HOA was in chaos, and Karen. She was seething. Mark was outside tending to his garden when he saw her storming toward his property, her face red with rage. Richard trailed behind her, looking exhausted and clearly trying to stop her from making things worse. "You," Karen screeched, jabbing a manicured finger in Mark's direction. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Mark barely glanced up from his work. "Oh, I think I do." Karen's nostrils flared. "My reputation is ruined. The HOA is turning against me. The news." She let out an unhinged laugh. "I've had reporters calling my house all morning." Mark straightened and dusted off his hands. "Well, maybe you shouldn't have harassed children at a public bus stop." Karen clenched her jaw. "You set me up." Mark raised an eyebrow. "No, Karen, you set yourself up. I just made sure people saw the real you." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Karen, enough. You need to let this go." But Karen wasn't listening. She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. "You think this is over? I'll sue you for defamation. I'll make sure you regret this." Mark chuckled. "Karen, you were the one caught on recording. If anyone has a case for defamation, it's me. And trust me, I'd love to see you try to explain that in court." Karen faltered for a second, but she was too stubborn to back down. "I'll get my position back in the HOA. I'll make sure your bratty kids aren't allowed anywhere near that bus stop again." The moment those words left her mouth, Richard groaned in frustration. "For God's sake, Karen, shut up." Mark just smiled. "That's funny, because as of this morning, the HOA board has officially removed you from your position." Karen blinked. "What?" Mark pulled out his phone and held up an email he had received earlier. "They had an emergency vote this morning. You're out." Karen snatched the phone from his hand, her eyes scanning the message in disbelief. Richard peered over her shoulder and sighed. "Well, guess that's official." Karen's hands started shaking. They can't do this. I built that HOA. They can't just." "They can," Mark interrupted. "And they did," he smirked. "You don't have any power anymore, Karen, no authority, no control, and nobody is coming to save you." Karen was speechless. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Richard, however, looked relieved. "Maybe this is for the best," he muttered. "Maybe now you'll finally stop treating people like your personal servants." Karen turned on him in a fury. "Oh, so now you're against me." Richard exhaled and shook his head. "I've always been against you, Karen. I just never had the guts to stop you, but he did." He nodded toward Mark. Karen let out a strangled noise of frustration and stormed back toward their house. Richard lingered for a moment before sighing. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about everything. She needed to be taken down a peg." Mark shrugged. "She took herself down. I just made sure she fell hard enough to feel it." And with that, Richard turned and walked away, leaving Karen to stew in her humiliation. Mark watched her retreat, feeling the satisfaction of true justice. But he wasn't done just yet. The days following Karen's downfall were nothing short of glorious. Without her iron grip on the HOA, the neighborhood began to change. People who had once cowered under her ridiculous rules started pushing back. The new HOA board immediately reversed several of her most absurd policies, like the one banning non-traditional holiday decorations and the rule requiring residents to keep their grass under exactly 3 inches. And Karen, she became the neighborhood pariah. The same people who had once been her loyal supporters now avoided her entirely. Parents whispered about her at school drop-offs, shaking their heads in disgust. The local Facebook group, which she had once moderated with an iron fist, was now filled with people openly celebrating her downfall. Even better, the school district completed its investigation and officially banned Karen from school grounds. She wasn't even allowed near the bus stop anymore. Mark made sure to take a nice, long walk past her house every morning just so she could see his kids standing at the bus stop, untouched and unbothered. Karen, of course, couldn't handle the humiliation. She made one last desperate attempt to regain her standing, calling for an emergency neighborhood meeting at her house. She invited the remaining HOA loyalists, hoping to rally support. Barely 3 people showed up. Mark, meanwhile, spent that evening barbecuing in his yard, enjoying the sight of Karen's pathetic little meeting falling apart as people trickled away one by one. And then the final blow came. One day, a moving truck appeared in front of Karen's house. Mark leaned against his porch railing, watching with interest as Richard supervised the movers. Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed, her face locked in a permanent scowl. Mark couldn't resist. He strolled over, moving out. Richard let out a tired chuckle. "I'm moving out, she's staying." He shook his head. "I've put up with her nonsense for years, but this was the final straw." Karen shot him a glare. "Oh, so you're abandoning me now?" Richard didn't even flinch. "No, Karen, I'm freeing myself." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Guess all that HOA power wasn't worth it, huh?" Karen glared at him, but she didn't say a word. For the first time, she had no threats, no smug remarks, just cold, bitter silence. Mark grinned. "Well, I'd say it's been fun, Karen, but honestly, this was way more fun for me than for you." Karen spun on her heel and stomped back into her house, slamming the door shut. Richard shook his head with a sigh. "She did this to herself." He looked at Mark. "Take care, man, and tell your kids I'm sorry for everything." Mark nodded. "Will do." As the moving truck pulled away, Mark took a deep breath and looked around his neighborhood. For the first time in years, it actually felt peaceful. And as he watched his kids laughing at the bus stop, free from Karen's harassment, he knew one thing for sure. Justice had been served,